I attended a wedding last weekend, one of those spare no expense affairs at a vineyard. The groom was standing there, champagne in hand, absolutely beaming. He was giving this heartfelt toast about partnership and sacred bonds, looking at his bride like she was the only person in the world. To everyone in the room, he looked like a man who had just won the lottery. But standing next to me was an old friend, a family law attorney who's seen the inside of more divorce courts than he cares to count. He wasn't smiling. He was watching the groom with this specific look of pity, almost like you'd look at a wounded animal that doesn't know it's hurt yet. He leaned in and whispered to me, "Look at him. He thinks he's building a legacy." But legally speaking, he just walked into a casino, put his house, his future earnings, and his access to his own unborn children on the table, and bet it all on a feeling. That stark contrast, the groom's romantic idealism versus the attorney's cold, mechanical reality, snapped something into focus. It wasn't just a wedding. It was the voluntary entering of a cage. The groom saw a sacrament, but the system saw a liability. And it made me realize that this invisible tension, this gap between what men are told society is and what it actually is, isn't just happening at the altar. It's happening in our schools, on our televisions, and in the very laws that govern us. So, okay, let's unpack that core tension. What we're really looking at today is the architecture of this invisible cage. It's the massive difference between the romantic promise of our big institutions, like marriage, and the sort of cold, mechanical framework that actually governs them.
The actuarial reality of it all.
Exactly. Our whole mission for this deep dive is to get into that gap, the one that men feel when they're trying to navigate a world that, well, that seems structurally biased against that traditional provider role. And we want to connect that very personal feeling to a much, much larger historical cycle.
And that's the key, right? This tension, it can feel so incredibly personal and so modern. Like it's happening just to you right now.
Yeah.
But what we need to do is zoom out. Because what's fascinating is that historically, a lot of analysts argue that these problems that seem so separate, a commitment crisis, this general cultural malaise, a decline in purpose, they're not separate at all.
They're all connected.
They're all predictable pattern signs of a huge systemic cultural shift. What we're hearing are the inevitable creaks and groans of a great historical machine that's grinding itself toward a cyclical halt. And to really get the present, we first have to put it into, well, a 5,000-year historical context.
So we're not starting in a modern courtroom or classroom. We're going way back. We're starting with the foundational framework of civilizational energy.
Precisely. We have to begin with the anthropological method. And for that, we look at the work of J.D. Unwin.
Unwin, right. Joseph Daniel Unwin.
He was a highly credentialed ethnologist and social anthropologist, had affiliations with both Oxford and Cambridge, and his landmark work, which is central to all of this, was published way back in 1934. It was called Sex and Culture.
And it's so important to frame this correctly. Unwin was approaching this whole thing not as, a moralist or some kind of preacher.
Not at all.
He was a pure data analyst. His goal was scientific, maybe a little controversial, but scientific. He was looking for quantifiable correlations between one very specific thing, sexual constraints and societal output.
That's it, exactly. He spent 7 years examining what was, for his time, a truly massive data set. He went through anthropological and historical records from 86 different societies and civilizations.
86.
And this stretched back across 5 millennia of recorded human history. So you're looking at everything from, simple Aboriginal tribes all the way up to huge, complex empires.
Like the Sumerians, Babylonians.
The Greeks, the Romans, the Teutons, the Anglo-Saxons. It was an incredibly comprehensive survey.
Okay, but if you're going to compare cultures, you need some kind of objective definition of success, right? How did he define a culture's flourishing?
That's a great question. Flourishing, for Unwin, was defined by objective, expansive achievements. It was evidence that a society's social energy was being funneled into productive work that, advanced the whole society.
So tangible things.
Very tangible things. He measured it based on advancements in fields like literature, drama, art, rational science, architecture, engineering, agriculture. Basically, the more creative and expansive a society's energy, the higher its culture ranked on his scale.
And after all that research comparing sexual rules against this measure of flourishing, what was the central finding? Was it consistent?
It was incredibly, almost unnervingly consistent. It showed a stark recurring pattern. He found that an increase in sexual constraints, and didn't matter if they were pre or post-marital, always preceded an increase in cultural flourishing.
Always.
Always. And the reverse was just as true and just as predictable. Increased sexual freedom always preceded a decline in that social energy and eventually cultural collapse. And this correlation held up no matter the geography, the race, or the time period.
Wow. Now, the model gets its real predictive power from this.
Yeah.
This time delay he observed, right? It wasn't an immediate thing.
Absolutely not. And that's probably the most profound piece of the puzzle, especially for applying this to today, the time lag. Unwin saw that if a society made a big shift in its sexual rules, either getting stricter or looser, the full effect wasn't really felt until the third generation later.
3 generations.
Yeah. And if you use that rough historical math of about 33 years per generation, you're looking at a full cycle of decline or flourishing taking about a century to completely play out.
100 years. Okay, let's get into the specifics of his system, because it wasn't just free versus constrained. It was more nuanced than that.
Much more. He categorized sexual constraints along 2 main axes. The first one was premarital constraints. So basically, how available was sex before marriage?
And on that axis, you have a clear ladder. At the very bottom, you've got complete sexual freedom. Prenuptial sex is just normal, unrestricted.
Then a step up from that, you had irregular or occasional restraint. This is where, maybe culture, religion required some periodic abstinence, some rituals, but for the most part, things were pretty free.
And at the very top of that ladder,
at the highest level of constraint, you had strict chastity. This is where remaining a virgin until your wedding day was required and expected by the culture.
Okay, so that's the first axis. Then you have the postmarital constraints, which is about the structure of the relationship itself, the household.
Right. And at the lowest level of constraint here, he identified something called modified monogamy. And this is going to sound jarringly modern.
Let me guess. One spouse at a time, but either person can end it whenever they want.
Exactly. Either party is legally and socially free to terminate the association at will, often without any penalty. It's the functional equivalent of modern no-fault divorce.
Wow. And then
you had modified polygamy, where a man could have multiple wives, but the wives were free to leave if they wanted to.
And the highest levels of constraint were obviously much more binding.
Oh, absolutely. You had absolute monogamy, which meant one spouse, and that union was for life or until death. There was no easy way out, sometimes no legal way out at all.
And the final one?
Absolute polygamy. The man could have multiple wives, but the wives were strictly confined, sexually, to only that husband for their entire lives.
So when you lay out all those combinations, which one produced the most? The highest output of that civilizational energy?
Unwin concluded that the most powerful combination for cultural flourishing, the one that generated what he called rationalist cultures, was that absolute pairing. Strict premarital chastity coupled with absolute monogamy.
And the sources really emphasize that achieving this, it wasn't just about saying no to sex. It was about redirecting that energy. It was about creating a kind of social engine.
Exactly. That's the core of the theory.
Right.
When those constraints were in place, that powerful, innate sexual drive that's in every single person, a drive that's normally just channeled into immediate gratification.
Yeah.
It was instead controlled and redirected.
Shifted to more productive work, as he put it.
Yes. This huge creative drive, when it was denied its easiest outlet, it was forced into building canals, writing epic poems, developing new forms of government, mastering engineering. The highest cultural achievement, the rationalist culture, was, in his view, simply the byproduct of a century of redirected biological energy.
And maintaining that level of discipline must have been incredibly difficult. Out of those 86 societies he looked at, how many actually got to that peak level and stayed there?
That's the thing, only 3. Just 3 of the 86 societies he studied ever managed to maintain that peak combination for the necessary 3 generations.
It's only 3.
The standard is just incredibly high. And maintaining that social discipline seems to be the hardest part of the whole civilizational life cycle, which is probably why the pattern of decline is so much more common.
Okay, so let's look at that decline. This is where the framework gets, well, unsettlingly predictive. What did Unwin find happened when a rationalist culture gave up that foundational rule of strict prenuptial chastity?
Again, the patterns were unambiguous and fast. Once strict prenuptial chastity was abandoned, he found that 3 major things vanished right alongside it, all within those crucial 3 generations.
What were they?
First, absolute monogamy broke down into those modified, easier-to-exit forms. Second, belief systems shifted away from deism. And third, critically rational thinking itself declined. The spiral was always downward, always toward more sexual freedom.
And the end of that spiral, the final stage of total freedom.
That state is the lowest form of flourishing. Unwin called it the inert or zoistic state. This is the point where the society has completely, utterly run out of social energy.
Let's spend a second on that term zoistic state, because the phrase he used, the dead level of conception, that's a pretty powerful image.
It implies a total cultural and intellectual stagnation. People in this state, they have very little interest in anything beyond their own immediate wants and needs. The pursuit of basic pleasure, comfort, instant gratification.
They're not building cathedrals.
They're not building anything long-term. They aren't engaged in these big, expansive societal projects or the rigorous pursuit of objective truth. They're just existing, really, on a biological level, focused only on the now. And crucially, at this lowest point of social energy, the culture is seen as ripe for replacement.
Meaning?
Meaning the sources suggest this inner culture is almost always conquered or taken over by another culture that has more social energy, often one that still has very high sexual constraints.
So the core idea is that civilization is this engine, and it's powered by redirected sexual energy from both men and women. And when that energy is just released into immediate gratification, the engine basically runs out of fuel.
That's a perfect summary. And it's worth noting, again, that while his work gets co-opted for all sorts of moral arguments, Unwin's analysis put the need for restraint equally on both sexes. His focus was specifically on restricting that prenuptial opportunity to harness the raw energy for social good.
Okay, so let's take this 5,000-year-old framework and drop it right on top of the modern West. The sexual revolution really kicks off in the late 60s, the 70s. So if we use Unwin's 33-year generation clock, we are now solidly in the second generation of that shift, and we're heading fast into the third.
And if you look around, we are seeing the classic predicted symptoms play out pretty much perfectly on schedule. The cultural landscape is, it's defined by the widespread availability of instant sexual gratification. The sources call it the Tinder and OnlyFans era.
Right, and at the same time, this immense skepticism toward lifelong commitment.
Exactly. So Unwin's timeline would suggest that the final, full descent into that inert state, we should be seeing that in the last decades of this century.
And we've definitely moved from absolute monogamy toward modified monogamy. That's just a fact of no-fault divorce. We see the decline of religious belief, which fits his decline of deism, and we see what he predicted about the decline of rational thinking.
That decline in rationality is so key. When a society gives up on shared objective standards for truth, those standards that take real intellectual discipline to maintain, it replaces them with appeals to purely subjective experience.
To feelings.
To feelings. Yeah. We now have a system where individual feelings can often supersede empirical data or logical argument. We tend to blame, social media or certain political movements for this. But Unwin's model suggests this loss of shared objective truth is an ancient, predictable feature of a civilization in its late-stage unwinding.
Now, I have to play devil's advocate for a second. An informed listener is going to immediately say, hold on, this is from 1934. We're talking correlation, not causation, and the world has fundamentally changed.
And that's a critical point. You have to acknowledge that. Unwin only claimed correlation, and today's world is just unrecognizable from the 1930s. Critics are very quick to point out at least 3 huge variables that completely change the consequences of sexual freedom today.
The first one has to be technology, right? Widespread, effective contraception, legalized abortion.
Without a doubt. Back in Unwin's time, more sexual freedom had immense, life-altering biological consequences. Unwanted children outside of marriage created immediate economic and social drag. That primary biological consequence was largely eliminated in the 20th century.
So that changes the whole equation.
It might. Unwin's theory depends on the redirection of energy. If technology erases the biological consequences of its release, does the need for redirection still have the same power? That's the modern paradox.
The second big challenge is the whole necessity versus sufficiency thing. We can look at societies today that are very strict, but they aren't exactly flourishing by Unwin's metrics.
Right. You look at a place like modern Iran or some highly orthodox communities, they often enforce the rules of absolute monogamy and strict chastity, but they aren't leading the world in scientific innovation or global influence. This suggests that sexual restraint might be a necessary condition to build up that latent social energy, but it's not sufficient on its own.
You still have to do something with the energy.
That energy has to be actively invested, which often requires political and legal stability, things Unwin didn't fully account for.
Which brings us to the third counterpoint. Maybe it's not about sex at all. Maybe decline is just about wealth.
The theory of complacency. The idea that when a culture becomes so incredibly wealthy and comfortable, people just stop struggling for basic needs. And the sources suggest that when life gets too easy, people lose the identity that comes from that struggle.
They turn inward.
They focus their energy inward, leading to what some sociologists call inner squabbles or ideological conflicts, instead of outward expansive achievement. In that view, the rise in sexual freedom isn't the cause of the decline, it's just another symptom of a deeper complacency, a loss of collective purpose.
That sets a really powerful historical stage. So if Unwin argues that civilization is built on channeling male energy into production through structures like absolute monogamy, what happens when the main reward for that energy, the family, is systematically penalized for the individual man?
And that's where we connect the abstract history to the concrete mechanical present. This is the transition from the grand anthropological view right down to the specifics of contract law. Yeah. This is where you see the modern architecture of the cage.
Meaning, if the whole civilizational engine needs motivated men channeling their drive into society building, and historically that was rewarded with status and a family, the system has to incentivize that.
But when the institutional framework actively disincentivizes it, the energy just dissipates.
And the absolute centerpiece of this disincentive is the legal status of the marriage contract in the West today.
The legal commentary on this is it's incredibly stark. For a man, the marriage contract is frequently described as, and I'm quoting here, the most dangerous contract he will ever sign.
And that's not an emotional statement. It's an actuarial one.
Exactly. It's portrayed as a profoundly one-sided agreement where, if it fails, the male party takes on a disproportionate amount of the liability.
And we're not just talking about splitting up the stuff you bought during the marriage. The liability is often seen as ongoing, stretching into the future.
That's the critical part. The liability extends to half of his future earnings, through long-term alimony or spousal support. It extends to assets he built up over decades. And, maybe most critically, to reduced or controlled access to his own children.
All of this liability is taken on under modern no-fault divorce laws, where the contract can be legally ended by either person for any reason at all.
Often without any proof of wrongdoing. This completely inverts the risk-reward ratio for the primary provider. The consensus among legal commentators in this space is that for a high-earning man, getting married without an ironclad, airtight asset protection strategy, like a very detailed prenup or setting up trusts, is just inviting total financial ruin.
So the legal system itself starts to look adversarial, or even like a tool of control.
For some men, absolutely. The sources we looked at describe the family law system as a weapon, a tool of unilateral male destruction, something used to enforce behavioral standards or punish emotional incompatibility, completely separate from a man's productive output or any actual legal wrongdoing.
And this is really best illustrated by the stories of men who did everything right, who played the traditional provider role perfectly, only to find the system defines their biggest strengths as defects. We have to talk about the story of Mark, the electrical engineer.
Mark is the quintessential provider. He worked, 60-hour weeks for 20 years.
Yeah.
He was stoic, focused on solving problems, provided stability, and built up significant assets.
The classic good husband and father.
By all traditional metrics. But when his wife initiated a divorce based on irreconcilable differences, his very ability to provide was then leveraged against him. And his whole way of being, his traditional masculinity, is what ended up undermining him in court. His desire to fix problems logically, to be stoic, to avoid endless emotional discussions. In the context of the divorce court and mediation, all of that was reframed. It was classified as a defect, as emotional unavailability.
Which is where this idea of the therapeutic state comes in. Can you define that for us?
Sure. The term therapeutic state is used because the modern family court system, and you see it in the workplace and schools too, it prioritizes psychological evaluation, mediation, and emotional management over old school legal contract interpretation or objective logic.
The language of feelings becomes the operating standard.
It really does. And that often clashes with the traditional male standard of logic, stoicism, and just performance.
Yeah.
So for a guy like Mark, his attempt to solve his divorce like an engineering problem, logically, efficiently, is just rejected. The system demands a kind of emotional processing he's not wired for.
So the result for him wasn't just losing half his wealth, it was something deeper.
It was profound anomie, A total disconnection from the social rules he'd lived his entire life by. He played by the rules for 2 decades, he built things, and then he watched the system, which is supposed to uphold social order, essentially punish his success and define his character as defective.
A total betrayal.
The sense of betrayal was total. And his advice to younger men after going through that was just unequivocal. Don't do it. It's a liability, not a life. And that personal withdrawal is a perfect echo of the institutional incentive structure breaking down.
And when that incentive structure breaks, there are massive economic consequences that tie right back to Unwin's energy theory.
The sources argue that the modern Western economy is heavily, maybe even 90%, driven by men who must work to provide for their family. The idea is that the whole machine of high achievement, of risk-taking, of high earning, it's all intrinsically tied to the need to support a nuclear family that, in theory, guarantees stability and reproductive success.
So if you remove that necessity, if the reward is no longer guaranteed but the financial liability is absolute, the logical response is to stop striving so hard.
Why would you? Why strive relentlessly for high achievement if you face a guaranteed catastrophic financial loss, half your future earnings, in a likely contract failure, all while living in a culture that actively disrespects the very role you're playing? The logical path for a lot of men becomes immediate withdrawal from that rat race.
And that withdrawal shows up as this archetype of men who retreat into a naturally minimalist lifestyle.
The economic logic is crystal clear. Why invest in a huge house, fancy cars, or a high-risk career if the financial upside is capped by this potential liability, and the emotional downside is maximized by the risk of losing it all? The sources suggest the rational economic choice is to become a minimalist, live in a clean but simple place, a flophouse with 40-year-old furniture, because the benefit of more ambition is completely eaten up by the increased risk. It's the financial version of Unwin's inertia.
And this isn't just a new thing either. There are historical sociological analyses that show this is a classic pattern.
Right. Dr. Carl Zimmerman's work from 1947, Family and Civilization. He studied the decline of countless civilizations, focusing specifically on their domestic structures.
And he found patterns.
He listed 8 specific patterns of domestic behavior that signaled a civilization was in decline. And if you use his framework, you see that the legal and social shifts we're talking about today, they align perfectly with those historical warning signs.
Which of his points are the most relevant right now?
Well, several of them are just glaringly relevant. First, the simple, massive increase in divorce rates, the literal breakdown of marriage. Second, the loss of the traditional meaning of the marriage ceremony itself. It's become more of a symbolic social event than a binding contract.
And the acceptance of adultery.
A growing desire for and cultural acceptance of adultery, which just fundamentally destabilizes that absolute monogamy structure. Zimmerman also cited the acceleration of juvenile delinquency, promiscuity, and rebellion, pointing to a loss of paternal authority.
Which aligns perfectly with this decline in social energy.
And finally, he pointed to the refusal of people to accept their family responsibilities, which ties right back to the disincentive. The legal and economic realities we're discussing are accelerating the abandonment of that provider role because men feel, I played by the rules and lost everything, so why would I invest my energy in this high-risk game?
Wow.
The echoes are just undeniable.
So if the legal and economic systems are structurally pushing men away, we have to look at how that psychological programming starts. And it starts much, much earlier. In our schools, in our culture.
Right. Now we're moving from the financial and legal architecture to the psychological construction of the cage. And you're right, the foundation is laid in childhood. This brings us to the concept of institutional misandry.
A systemic bias where natural male energy isn't just misunderstood, but it's actively pathologized.
The very energy that Unwin saw as the raw fuel for an expansive society. That kinetic drive, the need to compete, to build, to explore in the modern education system. That energy is often treated as a behavioral disorder that has to be medicated into submission.
And there's data to back this up.
There is. The data supports a structural issue within the American education system, which is increasingly designed for compliance and stillness. As of 2022, boys are more than twice as likely to be diagnosed with ADHD than girls. We're talking 15% versus 8%.
That's a huge disparity. It suggests the system is basically treating typical male energy as a problem to be solved with drugs instead of channeling it into something productive.
Yeah, and think about the deep psychological conditioning that creates. It teaches young men to see their own innate nature as inherently defective. The anecdote about the former Marine father just illustrates this perfectly.
His son was high energy, competitive, and the school described him as a defective product that needed to be recalled.
Their focus was entirely on his non-compliance. But the father, coming from a more traditional framework, he saw something totally different. He saw a boy with fire in his belly. He saw potential. He saw raw, powerful, kinetic energy.
So the very institutions that are supposed to educate and civilize are seen by some as trying to put that fire out, demanding an apology for the very traits that historically led to success.
The men being produced are conditioned for compliance, not for expansive achievement. It's a perfect setup for Unwin's zoistic state.
And then that conditioning gets reinforced over and over by the cultural narratives we get from the media, which brings us to the Homer Simpson effect.
This is more than just a funny observation. It's a systematic cultural trope. The doofus dad, the incompetent husband, it is absolutely everywhere in sitcoms, ads, family dramas.
The father is consistently portrayed as this well-meaning but incompetent fool. He can't handle simple tasks. He's constantly being managed or outsmarted by his hyper-competent wife and even his kids.
You can name dozens of examples, from cartoons to primetime comedies, where the plot hinges on the smart, capable mom stepping in to save the day from the bumbling, infantile dad.
And this systematic dismantling of paternal authority, it has to have a real cultural erosion effect.
A profound one. When the media consistently, pervasively portrays the father as an incompetent figure, it fundamentally shifts the dynamics inside the family and across society.
What are the direct consequences?
Well, it teaches women, consciously or not to respect their husbands, especially when it comes to decision-making or intellectual stuff. It teaches kids not to respect their father's authority or wisdom. This continuous erosion just carves out the foundation of patriarchy, not as an oppressive structure, but as a system of male-led order and responsibility, and it leaves behind what the sources call a hollowed-out shell.
Paternal wisdom is replaced by a caricature. He's just another child for the mother to manage.
Exactly. And when you combine the legal liability we talked about with this pervasive cultural disrespect, you get a profound psychological cost for the men who are actually trying to uphold traditional values.
The ones who are trying to promote meritocracy, responsibility, strength.
Right. This is where that sense of noble betrayal comes from. A man strives to be the good, capable provider and father, to instill virtues like resilience and hard work in his kids, but the society institutionally and culturally expects only incompetence or apology, especially when navigating ideologies that view those very virtues as toxic.
They're trying to raise a warrior poet in a culture that demands they be either a villain or a clown.
That's a great way to put it. And in that environment, the choice to withdraw becomes completely rational. If the system pathologizes your energy, demands an apology for your masculinity, and offers overwhelming financial and familial liability in return for playing the game, a lot of men are just going to retreat.
And that retreat shows up in some pretty stark sociological data.
It does. It directly depletes that pool of Unwin's social energy. You see increased male rates of suicide. You see the retreat into neat status, not in education, employment, or training, where men become those natural minimalists and end up leeching off the government or their family. Or, on the other extreme, you see a desperate retreat into these hyper-focused, disciplined communities like the military, where their energy is actually valued instead of pathologized.
And this isn't just an American problem. This decline in healthy relationships and male motivation, it's happening globally.
That's a vital piece of context. You see these steep declines in marriage rates, relationship quality, and fertility rates all across Europe and much of East Asia. It suggests this is a globalized cultural and economic effect of late-stage industrialization, combined with sexual liberation and the erosion of those traditional legal contracts.
Which brings us to the logical conclusion of Unwin's prediction. If the energy is lost, the civilization has to face its demographic destiny.
And that's where all these threads, the anthropological pattern, the legal disincentives, the cultural erosion, they all converge. They all fuel the core crisis, the catastrophic loss of social energy that leads directly to civilizational decline. And this is something you can actually observe mathematically.
And that energy loss shows up most clearly in the demographic crisis. The rapidly falling performance, total fertility rates, or TFR, across almost every developed nation.
The TFR you need just to replace your current population is 2.1 children per woman. Most industrialized nations are way, way below that.
When a population stops replacing itself, the population pyramid flips upside down.
Exactly. Instead of a big, wide base of young workers supporting a small peak of elderly retirees, you get an inverted pyramid.
Yeah.
A massive, growing elderly population being supported by a shrinking base of young working-age people.
And the economic impact of that shrinking base is immediate, and it's severe. Every developed nation is fighting this right now.
The fiscal consequences are just profound. A declining population means fewer young workers paying into the tax base, into social security systems. But those systems are what support the growing elderly population's pensions and social commitments.
It creates a death spiral.
A fiscal loop, yeah. The government is forced to siphon money from other departments, which leads to massive deficits, more government debt, and that stifles future growth. And since the older population is the most reliable voting bloc, cutting their benefits is politically impossible, which just compounds the debt problem for the next generation.
And to see the really extreme end of this, you just have to look at Asia. South Korea, for example. Their TFR is, what is it now?
As of 2024, it's at 0.72. That is less than a third of the replacement rate. It's catastrophic.
And that demographic loop, it's self-reinforcing.
Totally. With birth rates that low, some commentators project that South Korea is facing an insurmountable societal collapse within 3 or 4 generations. Fewer kids means fewer people to do low-skill labor jobs, which leads directly to something called the middle income trap.
Explain that, the middle income trap, in this context.
It's when a developing economy industrializes, it reaches middle income status, but then it gets stuck. It fails to become a high-income nation. In this demographic context, the shrinking workforce means labor gets expensive too quickly. Companies can't compete internationally with cheap labor anymore, but they haven't invested enough in high-tech automation or high-skill education to compete at the top end.
And the unemployed are less likely to start families.
Which reinforces the loop that leads to fewer and fewer people.
So if your native population pyramid is shrinking at the bottom, which it is in the US, Europe, and China, and your economy still needs young, cheap labor to fund the massive debt you owe to the politically active elderly, what's the obvious economic solution that governments turn to?
Immigration. And this is where the mechanism for cultural replacement, just as Unwin predicted, comes into sharp focus. The birth rate decline in the West is, functionally, being countered by an influx of immigrants, often from countries with much higher birth rates. The sources cite Middle Eastern and African countries in particular.
And these incoming cultures often bring with them much more patriarchal, religious, and conservative values. Specifically, the very high constraint sexual rules like strict chastity and absolute monogamy that Unwin identified with higher social energy.
This fits Unwin's ultimate mechanism of civilizational collapse perfectly.
Yay.
The collapsing culture, having dwindled into that zoistic state where its people only seek immediate gratification and refuse to reproduce, it can't sustain itself.
Right.
It welcomes the new demographic because the cheap labor is too tempting to fund its entitlement.
And the prediction is?
The predictive model suggests that these more constrained, higher energy cultures eventually just take over the social structure. They replace the inert original culture, and that starts a whole new cycle of high social energy, which then begins its own long, slow descent.
It's the ultimate endgame of the provider incentive structure collapsing.
It is. The man who retreats from that high-risk provider role, he's actually accelerating the demographic inevitability, which ensures that the very culture that pathologized his energy will be replaced by a culture that values and demands it, even if that energy is provided by a whole new set of men.
We started this deep dive with a single moment, a wedding, a moment of idealism crashing headfirst into a cold, mechanical, legal reality. From there, we've unpacked historical models spanning 5,000 years, analyzed the actuarial realities of modern contract law, investigated these pervasive cultural narratives that are shaping the male experience, and traced the demographic consequences of all of it coming together.
And that journey, from Unwin's patterns to the societal symptoms we see today, the erosion of rationality, the rise of the therapeutic state, the economic disincentive of the provider, it reveals that the cage isn't really metaphorical. It's built, piece by piece, across history and law.
So you now see the legal traps, the educational conditioning, the media narratives, not as these isolated, frustrating problems, but as predictable patterned symptoms of a vast historical and anthropological cycle that's now in its late stage unwinding.
And that clarity, that ability to recognize the historical pattern and understand the structural incentives that are driving this societal decline.
Yeah.
The awareness that you are navigating an institutional reality designed to channel, or in this case, deplete civilizational energy.
Yep.
That makes you a sober person in a drunk world. And that realization is, in an age of managed decline, the only real power you have left.